And there's so many people who've said they're not citizens.
Right.
They don't deserve due
Yes.
process. That is not true. Most of my clients have committed nothing, no violation at all. They are not El Salvadoran prisoners. They are US prisoners who are being housed in El Salvador. My advice to all my clients who have been coming into my office is the following.
When Republican Donald Trump lamented during the presidential campaign that America was not attracting immigrants from, quote, nice countries like Denmark, many believed he was simply stoking the racist flames of a segment of his MAGA supporters. Today, however, with President Trump's crackdown on illegal and in some cases legal immigrants, mostly from non-European countries, it's clear he's forging an immigration policy that gives preference to whites. Trump's recent invitation to white South Africans to come to America as refugees, at a time the administration is blocking refugee admissions from the rest of the world, is an indication of his intentions. So, what should we make of the president's interpretation of the words, quote, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, inscribed on the Statue of Liberty? I'm Bertram Souza, veteran Mahoning Valley journalist and host of the Scribbler video podcast, welcoming you to our continuing discussion of the politically volatile issue of immigration. I'm joined today by my co-host, Dr. Taji Terrell, former professor at Youngstown State University. Our guest today is Farhad Sathna, a renowned immigration lawyer with offices in Cuyahoga Falls. Last month, Attorney Sethna participated in the Akron Roundtable's discussion on immigration. He also is an adjunct professor of immigration law at the University of Akron. Well, thank you, Farhad, for joining us today. It was a pleasure meeting you. I'm glad you agreed to drive all the way from Akron to meet with us in Youngstown, so we appreciate that. We want to focus on the all-important and politically volatile issue of immigration, especially with this administration. But before we get into that discussion, tell us about yourself, your background, your professional background, and also how did you get interested in immigration? Was there a certain time or something happened in your life that said to you, I need to focus on immigration law? So give us your story.
Well, first of all, Bertram and Taji, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. Let me break this up a little bit. I am from India originally, and therefore I'm an immigrant. Mm-hmm. And it was very natural for me when I went to law school at the University of Akron in Ohio that foreign students started asking me legal questions. And simple things like landlord-tenant or a lease or something to do with the contract or maybe an accident issue. And then those questions started turning into immigration questions. And being the only foreign student at Akron Law, I was easy to find, easy to pick out of a crowd, and friends started asking me these questions, and I started answering those questions. My first job actually was in a law firm in Akron doing commercial law and bankruptcy. And that firm was extremely, extremely kind to me, very encouraging, and they let me start to branch out into immigration law. So that's what I started doing. Little by little, I started doing more and more of immigration until 5 years later, I started my own practice in immigration law. So as an immigrant coming to America, it seemed to be a natural pathway for me to also start practicing immigration law once I got my law degree. And as I said, the firm was very kind to me. And then I started my own law practice. I've been on my own for 30 years now. And I'm very proud to say that I have been successful. Thanks again to the community and, of course, to the people who have been my clients and supported me.
And so would you say most of your clients are immigrants, are people who are seeking immigration status, are naturalized citizens, people seeking citizenship? Is that...
That's absolutely right. About 95% of my practice is immigration law, and about 5% to 10% of my practice is business law.
Okay. So, given that, what do you make of President Trump's crackdown on illegal and even in some cases legal immigrants, the administration's revocation of international student visas, and also their plan to send U.S. citizens who are considered the worst criminals to prisons abroad. Give us that overarching issue of immigration right now.
You've asked me so many questions, Bertram, in one question.
Okay.
And that's a massive multi-part omnibus question, if there
Okay.
ever was one, okay? Let's start with what you're saying about President Trump. President Trump campaigned on the rhetoric that immigrants are bad people. We may always remember, and it's probably going to go down in history, of his memorable quote about Haitians in Ohio. They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. And a lot of this rhetoric, unfortunately, goes back to what dictators have done throughout history, which is dehumanize sections of the population that they don't care for. Hitler did this to Jews before World War II, when he dehumanized them, made them into parasites and leeches and called them all kinds of names, leading of course to what we saw happen in World War II. Before the Holocaust came Kristallnacht.
Right.
Came the total despicable way in which Jews were dispossessed of their homes, their possessions, their businesses. And they were dehumanized, put on trains and sent out to the terrible concentration camps of World War II. We know what happened to them. A terrible thing. The same thing is happening here. No one is saying that Trump is sending people to concentration camps, but by dehumanizing human beings, i.e. immigrants, he's laying the foundation for saying they're not worthy of protections under the Constitution. For example, going to your next part of your question, the right of due process. And there's so many people who've said they're not citizens.
Right.
They don't deserve due
Yes.
process. That is not true. I want to make sure your viewers understand this. The Constitution applies due process to all persons in the United States, not just citizens. So even illegal immigrants, legal immigrants, naturalized citizens, and natural-born citizens are all subject to the rights of due process enshrined in the 5th and the 14th Amendment of the United States. Finally, I'll say this to you in reference to your question about overall policies that President Trump has implemented on immigration. These are not new laws. These are simply executive actions.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions.
Go-
Like if
Right,
there's any
right.
change in the law.
And there's no change. What's happened is a change in the policy of the government enforcing those laws. And by that what I mean is the laws have always been on the books, but how you enforce them and the willingness to take actions that are going beyond what might be the scope of the law is what changes or defines this administration so differently from what has happened with immigration enforcement in past administrations.
So is the administration or Trump overreaching when he talks about an emergency that exists in America? That America is at war. There are these foreign invaders coming in that are putting Americans' lives in danger. Explain his legal rationale, if he has one, for that.
I can't explain what's going on in President Trump's mind. Okay? I can't explain what's going on in anybody else's mind. I can't pretend to do that. But yes, he has invoked the Alien Enemies Act. He's declared an invasion by invaders, i.e., people who are here from other countries, sometimes without documentation. He's using that as a cudgel to claim that America has a right to fight back against these invaders, using all means at its disposal to rid our nation of this invasion of what they've been called even as locusts and parasites. Not to mention he's used harsh words like rapists and murderers and thugs against the immigrant population.
And so, at what point are the courts willing to intervene to talk about his invocation of the Alien Enemies Act and those other kinds of laws?
That's a great question. And honestly, Bertram, we've got a situation where the Supreme Court has spoken out now many times with many emergency actions being brought before the court. This is outside the usual purview of the writ of certiorari and the process that cases have to go through to be filed with the Supreme Court. We have seen more executive actions being challenged with the Supreme Court within the first 100 days than we probably have collectively in the history of the Supreme Court, okay? Between Biden, George Bush 1 and the Obama administrations, there were hardly a handful of cases brought before the Supreme Court as emergency petitions. Supreme Court was very selective in taking those petitions. Now we see them being filed on a weekly basis. I think we're up to maybe 15 emergency actions now been filed with the Supreme Court already within the first 120 days of this administration. So what we have here is the court stepping in and saying, in the Alien Enemies Act, for example, that the administration could invoke the Alien Enemies Act, but it had to give each and every individual charged with deportation a right of due process, i.e., at least a 30-day window to challenge their removals from the United States. Now, the Trump administration didn't like it.
Right.
And so it has been violating that edict of the Supreme Court over and over since it came out. The fundamental linchpin of that particular issue of the Alien Enemies Act started with a man, as you may recall, called Abrego Garcia.
Right.
Abrego Garcia is from El Salvador, and Abrego Garcia received what is called withholding of removal. That is the right not to be sent back to El Salvador because he would potentially be hurt by the very gangs from which he was fleeing El Salvador. Well, Trump deported him to El Salvador. Until today, he remains in El Salvador, and the Trump administration, despite Supreme Court requirement, has failed to facilitate his return back to the United States and is in fact giving a U.S. judge, federal district judge, a runaround by not bringing him back and not providing reasons as to why not. In fact, Trump has famously said that Abrego Garcia is now in El Salvador,
right,
and he lacks the authority to bring Abrego Garcia back, which is nonsense because Trump sent him there, paid $6 million to the president of El Salvador, okay, to keep these people in El Salvador at their maximum security prison, and now says he can't bring him back. Well, let me tell you, Abrego Garcia and the other 250 Venezuelans who are in El Salvador right now are not prisoners of the state of El Salvador. The state of El Salvador is a nation by itself which has not sentenced any of these people to prison. They are not El Salvadoran prisoners. They are US prisoners who are being housed in El Salvador. So USA has every right to bring them back anytime it wants to. It's like you're renting storage space in a storage unit. It's still your stuff in the unit. You can put the stuff in there. You can take the stuff out whenever you want to. It's not that El Salvador's president has the right to release those people. No. Trump has the right to say, it's my stuff, I want it back.
Right. You had talked about due process. Do non-citizens and even international students, visitors coming to the U.S., do they enjoy free speech protections of the Constitution as American citizens do?
Well, here's another celebrated case. Mahmoud Khalil. Mahmoud Khalil is an activist who demonstrated at Columbia University for Palestinian rights. In other words, against the whole-scale war being waged by Israel against defenseless civilians in the Gaza Strip and also now in the West Bank. For his trouble, Mahmoud Khalil was arrested by ICE and is been placed in deportation proceedings, and thankfully through quick action by his lawyers at the American Civil Liberties Union still remains in the United States and has not been sent back either to Syria, where he's originally from, or potentially to Algeria. Okay? Now, Mahmoud is a classic example of the exercise of free speech rights. If we have free speech being utilized by one section of the population, it's only fair that free speech be utilized by other sections of the population as well. In fact, the entire premise of free speech is that speech as unpopular as it may be, is still protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And that's been a linchpin of our nation, which has set our nation aside from other countries with despotic regimes which want to control the narrative. And Mahmoud Khalil did exactly that. In fact, he was placed in deportation and arrested by agents who weren't even aware that he was already a permanent resident of the United States. Since his time in prison, his wife, who sponsored him and how he became a permanent resident, who's a U.S. citizen, gave birth to their U.S. citizen son, who he hasn't even been able to spend time with because he's in detention at a federal facility in Louisiana, while his deportation case rages on in Louisiana and a habeas petition remains pending with a federal district court in New Jersey. So I would caution students who are here on F1 student visas, visitors, or anybody else to be prudent. Remember, discretion is the better part of valor. So come to the USA, do your studies, enjoy yourselves, spend your dollars, because we want your money, of course, and then go back home quietly, okay? Because it's not worth risking the ire of the Trump administration and its cronies, including Marco Rubio, I'm sorry to say, who I thought would be a much more sensible person, including Marco Rubio, and incurring their ire and potentially revocation of your visa, revocation of your right to stay here, and God forbid, detention and deportation.
Okay, Taji.
Right. I have a more practical question. Under what circumstances can a green card holder's status be revoked?
The circumstances are set forth in the Immigration Act, and they range from being on the highest level, a potential threat to national security or terrorist issues, to at the lowest level, even conviction for 2 or more misdemeanors, which might be used as crimes of moral turpitude.
So this is according to the law?
According to the law.
Okay.
What we are potentially seeing now with this administration and its revocation, for example, of Mahmoud Khalil's permanent resident status, is a very, very rarely invoked section of the immigration law in which the Secretary of State can make a determination that the alien's presence in the United States is against the foreign policy interests of the United States. Okay? That, believe it or not, one of the celebrated people who had suffered under that same yoke was, in the 1950s, Charlie Chaplin. In the 1980s, John Lennon. Okay? Because they were viewed as being antithetical to the interests of the United States. Charlie Chaplin, actually, if you watched the biopic on his life, was served with a letter from Edgar Hoover as his ship left New York Harbor saying, "Don't come back or we will arrest you." He finally did come back in the 1980s to receive an award at the Academy Awards, Lifetime Achievement Award, only because he was assured by the US government that he would not be arrested and those charges had been laid to rest. So he came back to the United States. John Lennon fought back, and a federal court case said that there was not enough evidence, obviously, to declare him persona non grata, so he could not be forced to leave the United States. His removal was not in the interest of the United States. So consequently, there have been celebrated cases, and now we have Mahmoud Khalil once again bringing the same very rarely used section of the immigration law back into the limelight.
So, what do you make of the Trump administration's plan to suspend habeas corpus, to make it easy to deport illegal immigrants first? But before that, explain the principle and then talk about the constitutionality, if you will.
Well, habeas corpus springs from that incredibly ancient text called the Magna Carta, in which was actually an agreement between the then English king and the people and the uprising to say, look, we are not going to have the king get absolute power. The monarch's powers must still be checked. And in this case, the monarchy, i.e. the federal government, has to be checked by allowing people to have an individualized determination of whether the monarch can continue to hold them or not. Habeas corpus is a Latin term which simply means let the body go. Let the person go. And so an action for habeas corpus is brought in the federal district court, usually in the location where the alien is being detained. Okay, it's brought against the federal government and the warden of the facility where the alien is being detained, plus whoever the agencies are that might be detaining the alien, maybe DHS, maybe whatever, FBI, whatever that might be, to let the alien essentially go. So that's the basis of habeas corpus. Now, with regard to the suspension of habeas corpus, that is extremely dangerous precedent. Why? We have seen throughout history that when leaders are given a chance to wield unchecked power, that power typically is not used in a benign fashion, but is used as a cudgel to beat its enemies. If today habeas corpus is suspended against quote-unquote undocumented aliens, what's there to stop habeas corpus from being now used against permanent residents, as Mahmoud Khalil? And finally, my dear friends, my dear viewers, my dear Bertram, my dear Taj, what's there to stop habeas corpus being used against naturalized citizens and potentially against native-born US citizens? So think about that. We talk about the slippery slope of the law. This indeed is not only a slippery slope, it is a very dangerous slippery slope, because if we go down that slope, it leads to a government which can imprison, detain, and deport even citizens of the United States.
Which brings me to the question. There was a warning on the internet that naturalized citizens like us should not leave the United States in this day and age because they may not be allowed to re-enter the US. Should that warning be taken seriously?
I have had this question posed to me by my clients, and my response to them has been no. You should travel. You should carry your passport. Of course, if you're coming back from foreign travel, you should be very careful about what you're carrying with you, bringing with you. You should be careful about information that is stored on your telephone or any other portable device. Why? Because the government has the absolute right, when you're entering the United States, to search your personal belongings, which includes any electronic media as well. So be very careful about what you have. And you should travel. You should not limit yourself. And the reason for my saying that is because when we empower the government by our own fear, we simply make that government much more reckless and much more willing to trample on our rights even further. So please travel, do what you need to, just be circumspect and careful and considered about what you're doing, either when you're traveling overseas, what you may be saying, and furthermore, what you're bringing back with you.
We're hearing a lot of cases recently where documented immigrants or people who are seeking asylum are going to court for their regular court hearings, and regardless of the decision by the court, they get arrested by ICE at the end of the court. So a lot of people are really afraid to go to court. Do you recommend people to show up in court for their court hearings if they're asylum seekers? Or if they don't go and appear at court, what happens?
Okay, that's a great question, and that's an issue that has emerged just in the last couple of weeks. In fact, I have put it on my Facebook page, on my LinkedIn page, and on my blog. So I commend viewers to look at that a little bit more for detail. But Taji's raised a good question, and the question is what do people do? My answer is number one. Never miss a court hearing, because when you miss a court hearing, you can be ordered removed in absentia, meaning in your absence. And that gives ICE a great reason to go out there and find you and arrest you and deport you, because now you've abandoned your relief, okay? Number two, get yourself a good qualified immigration attorney, okay? Don't go to court without an attorney. Number three, have a backup plan. Maybe it is have a habeas corpus petition ready to be filed with the district court if you're detained. Or number 4, have a credible application for some kind of relief pending with the immigration court or already filed with the immigration court. That might be an application for asylum, it might be a waiver application, it might be a petition with the USCIS that requires the immigration court to adjudicate, it might be a family-based petition which also has immigration court implications. There are a number of things. We can't discuss those obviously in detail in the scope and time of this podcast, but there are a number of things that people can do in order to protect themselves and their families from being summarily removed from the United States without due process.
So if they don't appear in court, they will definitely get deported immediately.
There are 2 things you said in that question which are not exactly true. Number 1 is they will definitely get deported, and number 2 is immediately. So Taji, what they're doing is they will be then subject to an order of removal because of their failure to appear. Mm-hmm. It's an in absentia order of removal, as I just explained. That doesn't mean ICE is going to run out and catch them right away and find them and deport them. But it gives them the leeway to go out there at their leisure and apprehend them, whether in a public place or in their home, and then put them on a plane and send them back. Now, I want to make 2 more points here, which you may be asking about in the future. But one of the very troubling things we are seeing is that we're seeing people being deported to third countries of which they're not even nationals. We have a plane full of people that is now sitting in Djibouti, because a federal judge said you can't drop these people off in South Sudan, for God's sake, which is raging with a civil war, and you're going to put Vietnamese and Thai people in South Sudan. How are they going to get back home? In the middle of a civil war, they will be nothing but dead meat in South Sudan. Okay, we don't have to keep those people here if they're criminals. They are going to be deported. Yes, I'm not arguing to be kept here. But what I am saying is we have an obligation as a civilized nation not to put them in the middle of a war zone,
which they have no relation to.
Which they have no relation to at all.
Yeah.
Okay, and send them back instead to their home countries. All right, this is all political theater being done to throw red meat to the clamoring masses. Dear masses, if you're listening to this video, please note that this could be you in the future. Even US citizens are being threatened with deportation to foreign prisons if they commit crimes. Which brings me to the question that you were going to ask me earlier. So do you want to restate that question, perhaps?
Actually, I do have one follow-up question. So is there a possibility for example, asylum seekers to have a lawyer and postpone their court hearings?
That's a great question. Postponing for the sake of postponing is not going to be looked favorably by the court. Number 2, the EOIR, Executive Office of Immigration Review, which essentially controls the immigration courts nationwide. There's about 760 immigration judges in very many courts nationwide now. There's over 60 courts, as I recall. So those judges have been instructed not to grant continuances for most cases. So it's going to be very hard. Number 3, if a person gets a continuance, typically their immigration clock is stopped, meaning they may not then be eligible for any other form of relief, including an employment authorization document. So there are consequences for failing to appear or for requesting continuances.
So in my introduction, I suggested there's a political element to all of this, that Donald Trump, through his immigration policy, has come up with his own interpretation of those famous words, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free," inscribed on the Statue of Liberty. He has made no secret of the fact that he wants more immigrants from nice European countries. And he has described third world countries and others as shithole countries. Being a naturalized citizen, give me your take on this aspect of the whole immigration debate.
Bertram, we need to go no further than to look at Trump's bold plan to give green cards to people for $5 million. The $5 million green card. Forget the tired, the poor, the huddled masses that made this country what it is today. We don't give a damn about you. Poverty is for suckers. We want the $5 million green card people to come in. And of course, if they're also willing to invest $1 million or $2 million in the latest Trump crypto scheme, that would be even better.
Actually, that happened in Turkey as well. People can buy Turkish citizenship, and we have a lot of drug lords and mafia who have been given citizenship in Turkey, and that has caused a lot of issues.
And there'll be a lot of Russian oligarchs coming to America.
Can you imagine the irony of that?
Exactly. When you participated recently in the Akron roundtable discussion on immigration, you made reference to that infamous or famous Nazi-era quote that starts off by saying, "First they came for the socialists." Expound on that, because it's very appropriate and timely given what's going on right now in America.
What I quoted, Bertram, was from a poem by a Lutheran minister called Martin Neumüller. And I'd like to quote that poem again.
Absolutely.
Many of us have heard this already, and then some version or the other. They came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. And I'm going to add one sentence here. Then they came for the immigrants, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't an immigrant. Then they came for me, and by that time, there was nobody left to speak up. And if we don't follow the rule of law, if we don't change our governmental structure by electing different people the next time around, we are doomed. Because in the famous words of Andrew Jackson, a president who had to confront a Supreme Court decision that he didn't like, and his words were, "The Supreme Court has made a decision, now let them get an army to enforce it." The Supreme Court and the federal courts are the third branch of government. They are powerless because they have no enforcement mechanism. They depend on the executive to enforce their orders. If the enforcement mechanism doesn't work, i.e. the federal government, the executive branch, does not listen to what the courts are telling it to do, who's going to police the henhouse? Nobody. The fox is going to be in that henhouse, and nobody's going to check the fox.
Which is why when you earlier talked about Trump ignoring Supreme Court rulings, he knows there's no enforcement. I mean, the marshal's office is not going to come to arrest him, so there's not going to be any kind of punishment involved, right?
Exactly. And in fact, I wrote about that last year in a blog article, which you can find on my blog, which is immigration-america.com. I wrote about the implications of the decision that the Supreme Court issued back in 2024. And in that decision, the Supreme Court basically granted Trump blanket immunity for everything which was within the purview of what could be considered presidential authority. And the issue of what constitutes presidential authority or not is, of course, something that's left up to discretion and deliberation. So it's a very dangerous point that we stand at when the Supreme Court has already granted Trump immunity for most presidential actions, and we don't have a president who's willing to comply with any future Supreme Court orders.
Do you have any concern about the way you speak out on this issue?
I've been warned by many people to be cautious about what I say and what I post.
People that you respect and people, or is it just people who are just fueling the flames of despair? Are these people who are warning you to be cautious, is their advice something that you would take seriously?
Their advice is something I would take seriously. They're people I know and love and care about, and I know that they love and care about me. And it's a issue of weight, Bertram. We've got to realize that in law and in society and in our civilized world, if we don't speak out for what is right and what we believe in, then perhaps a victory or survival today may not lead to a future that we would care to live in tomorrow. And if I'm only going to survive and exist, then what is my point of being a purposeful human being? Being a lawyer, knowing the law, being willing to help people. Where do I draw the line? If I cow down and do nothing, am I being just as enabling of things that are going wrong in this country? I don't want to be that person. I came to America as a individual foreign student because I loved the American ideal, the freedom of speech, the fact that even a president of this country could be impeached. He was not above the law. And I want to uphold those ideas. I want to give our Constitution life, and I want to make sure that other people also benefit from the processes, the powers, and the rights that are enshrined in this Constitution, not just for citizens, mind you, dear viewer, but for all persons in the United States.
When the Vindicator was publishing, we are in the building that once housed the newspaper, I used to write a Sunday column, and mostly about politics and about politicians. And I would get calls on a Monday. The column would run on a Sunday. And I get calls from people saying, why don't you go back to the country you came from? You don't belong here. Even though if you're a citizen, you should be grateful and shut your mouth. Are you hearing that kind of reaction to your, sort of criticism of what's going on?
Not yet, but I fully expect that I will hear it. And my answer is going to be the following. My answer is going to be, this is my country. I'm a citizen just as you are. And United States law till today does not make a distinction between naturalized citizens and native-born citizens. We do not have two classes of citizen. And I want to tell them exactly that. This is my country. And how dare you tell me to go back?
And considering everybody in this country is basically an immigrant, even Marco Rubio or his family,
parents, yeah.
They are either immigrants or they are children of immigrants, unless you are a
Native American absolutely.
Who was born here, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And in fact, the Native Americans have been done a great disservice because we all know what has happened to them and how they've been displaced. Right. They are truly the only people who are here originally.
Right.
Everybody else came from somewhere else. Something that they have conveniently forgotten.
International students are being advised to carry their passports and other documents with them at all times. Would you give the same advice to naturalized citizens, especially those who are not white?
My advice to all my clients who have been coming into my office is the following. Don't carry your original documents because they can be lost. They can be stolen. Cars can be broken into. Things can be forgotten at airports. Okay? Instead, take good, clear pictures with good light of those documents. Store them on your phone. Identify them as favorite pictures. So you're not scrolling through 10,000 pictures of your 15 different vacations. And therefore you can identify those and bring those up immediately if you're asked and stopped and asked to provide identification. It's not hard to do. Take a picture of your passport. If you don't have a passport, take a picture of your certificate of naturalization. If you're born in this country, take a picture of your birth certificate. And take a picture of some other ID, like your state ID, okay, your driver's license, things like that. Store them in your phone, mark them as favorites. If you're a foreign student or a foreign visitor to this country, download what is called a Form I-94. It's issued by the CBP. It's available on the web. Download your Form I-94, store it as a PDF on your phone. Again, mark it as a favorite so that you have that picture there. Someone stops you. We're seeing increasing instances of local sheriff's deputies being deputized to perform immigration functions. And they don't know much about immigration. So we've got to almost educate them that, look, here's my I-94. I came to this country legally. I'm a student. Here's my I-20. Or I came as a visitor. Here's my I-94. I'm valid to stay until such and such date. That date hasn't yet come. But if we don't have these documents easily at hand, there's every opportunity for them to pick you up, take you to some detention center, send you to Louisiana, for God's sake, before you can ever contact someone and sort out that mess. And in the course of doing that, you may be housed with actual criminals, people who are thugs and rapists and murderers, and who are US citizens.
I do understand that we have a crackdown on criminals and people who are disrupting the society and all that. But have you seen an increasing clients facing deportation proceedings despite having legal status, no criminal record? And do you see any common patterns or triggers of those legal immigrants
Yes.
who have nothing to do with crime?
Yes, I do. In fact, a classic example would be the recent Venezuelans who have been brought to this country under humanitarian parole, have entered this country legally, been paroled into this country, and now that humanitarian parole might be cancelled. And so there is a huge fear in the Venezuelan community, the Haitian community, I'm sure in the South, in Miami, Cuba, among the Cuban community as well, and so on. So there is definitely a big fear. And I see those communities being targeted because they are what I would call the low-hanging fruit. They're right there to be picked. They're identified, they've given addresses to the government knows where to find them, they've got pending cases, let's say an asylum court, immigration court for relief, and they're easily identifiable, and they're not criminals. Most of my clients have committed nothing, no violation at all. The few that have might have a speeding ticket. Okay? That's their violation.
So is that possible according to the law?
No.
Having a traffic violation can cause deportation?
No, it is not. That's where we're seeing the extension, overextension, hyperextension, overreaching of this administration to take people, strip them of their status, and deport them. The goal is to have 3,000 people deported per day. It's like a mill. Imagine a mill. The Nazis perfected this in the concentration camps. We are not a concentration camp. We are America. We can do better.
The administration obviously is making headlines daily with this whole immigration crackdown. And Republicans on Capitol Hill, afraid of Donald Trump, remaining silent. Their criticism is muted at best. Are there people in your community, in Ohio, around the country that you know, not just immigrants, not just naturalized citizens, but actual native-born Americans who are as concerned about what's going on as you are? And are you sort of feel emboldened that there are indeed Americans who are willing to speak out the way you are?
Yes to all those questions. There are good people everywhere, and there are good people who are sick of this. There are good, staunch Republicans who are also shocked and appalled by what is going on.
And when you're able to talk to them, what do they say about Trump and his administration?
Well, the discussion has never been positive toward Mr. Trump and his administration. But we've got to do something. And I'm going to ask you all viewers to write down this website and go visit it if you want to help someone who has an immigration issue. The website is saveimmigrantfamiliesusa.com. It's all one word, saveimmigrantfamiliesusa.com. And on that website is a plethora of information, including a questionnaire on how to identify whether an alien has any kind of immigration relief, and then find out that information and contact a qualified immigration lawyer to maybe start those processes to assist that alien.
I was always surprised about that term alien, because you're always called an alien when you come to the United States from another country. I don't know, it just sounds
You're
a
from
little
outer space.
funny.
Well, that's a term that's been used in the immigration
Yes.
law for
Yeah.
decades. So, in fact, for over a century. And so, consequently, it just means someone who's not a U.S. citizen.
Right.
In fact, even if you have a green card, you're still a resident alien.
That's
Until
right.
you become a U.S. citizen, you're a resident alien. So you have non-immigrant
Okay.
aliens and you have immigrant aliens. Those who have a green card are immigrant aliens. Those who who have a non-immigrant, who are in non-immigrant status, which may be F1 student, B1 visitor, H1 worker, what have you, are non-immigrant aliens.
So I have a question about the Alien Enemies Act, which can only be used if there's an invasion. And obviously there's no invasion at the moment in the United States. How did the court say that it was okay to use that?
That's a great question. Again, it came out of an executive action and a decree and then an emergency petition to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so the court did not really spell out its reasoning very well as to how the Alien Enemies Act can be applied in this context. But safe to say that what the court did was, it didn't say the Alien Enemies Act could be applied in a sense of carte blanche removal of all aliens. What it said was that the administration could apply the Alien Enemies Act in the sense of bringing removal actions against the aliens. And the aliens could not defend themselves using what is called the Administrative Procedures Act. So there's a differentiation here that the court didn't say that the government was justified necessarily in using the Alien Enemies Act, but that the defendants, the aliens who were being deported, could not use the Administrative Procedures Act to prevent their deportation, but instead the Alien Enemies Act could be used by the government to seek to deport them. However, with safeguards. And those safeguards were, which the government is trying to flout regularly, and every federal district judge is probably keeping their eyes on the radar at this point in time. The safeguards were that every alien who's being sought to be deported under the Alien Enemies Act provisions or any kind of executive action such as expedited removal for aliens has a right to a due process, 30 days opportunity to rebut those government accusations and to file for habeas corpus. However, habeas corpus cannot be filed on a class-wide basis. It has to be filed on an individualized basis, which does put an enormous burden on aliens because, number one, they're detained in some remote facility in God knows where, in the bayous of Louisiana or in the jungles of Georgia, okay, or in the remote regions of Texas, and they've got to find an attorney, have the funds to retain the attorney, and then file for the habeas action in the nearest district court. Okay, now, in addition to those problems, we have another issue too that comes up. Language. Aliens are being served with papers in English. They have no idea what they're reading, what they're signing, what those papers are even saying. We have the other issue, which is access to justice. Aliens can't afford, and lawyers can't afford, to go to these remote places and file habeas petitions without having some form of remuneration. And so that's why I'm going to urge again your viewers to maybe start making donations, even if it's a small amount, to groups like the ACLU, okay, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, okay, law schools themselves that have maybe clinics that support immigration law. The Constitution Research Center, all of those places which are supporting the rights of due process. I'm not saying we're supporting illegal immigration. I am saying we are supporting the due process of law, because without that, we are all in danger of an overreaching federal government.
So, as we come to a close, what is your sense of what's going to happen with this? Where are we going from here?
My sense is one of a place in America where we have come, which has been entirely unprecedented to me at least. And my sense is that the beleaguered court system, which is at this point in time our only line of defense against Mr. Trump and his machinations, is going to at some point in time be overwhelmed for two reasons. By the simple weight of the number of lawsuits being brought, and number two, by the fact that its directives are ineffective and it has been emasculated. Unless the Supreme Court comes out with a straightforward decision that says you must do this and you cannot do that, and Trump precipitates a constitutional crisis which potentially could lead to enough Republicans in Congress voting to impeach, we're going to see this position get worse.
You don't believe that we are in a constitutional crisis yet?
Not yet, because we've not reached a point where within the executive branch we have a chaos between can we do this or can we not do this. There is no constitutional crisis yet, but we are coming very close to that. The same point I'd like to expand upon for a moment more is this, that if we have a Supreme Court whose edicts are not adhered to, are not respected, we've got a situation where we have a breakdown, a total breakdown in the government, because then Trump and his minions will be empowered and emboldened to do whatever they feel like.
And what is the point of a court in that case?
There's no point.
Right.
The third branch of government is essentially been neutered, and that's why in another year and a half we're going to have midterms for the House and 1/3 of the Senate. And my urge is to people to look at what's happening, because the only way we can change this dynamic is by changing the people who are our representatives and our senators to people who are more moderate, more considered, and who actually respect the Constitution and not the unbridled and unchecked power that President Trump claims he has.
But Trump, in his first term, and this should come to no surprise to anyone, in his first term in 2017, I think it was, made it clear that he thought that the three co-equal branches of government was an archaic principle, that the presidency should be more powerful than the other two branches. And that's what he's doing through his executive orders today. I mean, he's basically saying the courts don't matter, Congress doesn't matter. I will cut funding that is the purview of Congress for agencies that I deem unnecessary. I will cut foreign aid because I'm the president. I think foreign aid is unnecessary. And I don't care what the courts say. What are they going to do? How are they going to enforce their rulings? That's exactly where we are today, right?
You're right.
And how do we respond to that?
We respond by the only way that we can under the Constitution. Elect representatives who are going to show some spine, some backbone. Okay? And number two, then follow the orders or force the orders of the court to be implemented by the executive branch by holding the power of the purse. Congress holds that power.
Right.
Congress can say, we are not going to give ICE a blank check. Congress can say, we want to restore the jobs that were eliminated from the various agencies. We're going to restore federal funding for incredibly important disease research, cancer research, immunizations. We've got to do that. We've got to have a Congress which can respect the courts and force the executive to do what the courts and Congress is telling it to do, not the other way around. Right now we have the executive telling the other two branches, number one, to the courts, I don't care to you, care about you, I'm not going to listen to you. And number two, to Congress, you need to do what you're going to do for me, because otherwise I will primary
Right.
you out of the next election.
Right.
We've got to stop that. That's not the American way. There was a system of checks and balances which has lasted beautifully for 250 years, and it's going to be destroyed in the next 3.
Well, Farhad, this has been a wonderful conversation. Really has been very interesting, very thoughtful, and obviously you know a great deal about this issue. I hope we can do this again as things unfold. And once again, we appreciate you coming all the way to Youngstown to meet with us.
Thank you for having me.